Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Here it's a good evening from Suffolk, England, and wishing you all a really warm welcome. My name is Lora Aziz. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, walker, and I'm here in today's capacity as the co-chair of the World Trails Network Arts and Culture Task Force. And this is a co-chaired project between Andrew Stuck, who is on the call, but driving, who is leading Walk, Listen, Create. And this is a series that is really exploring a simple but quite profound question: when does a walk become a pilgrimage? Tonight's session is Sacred Steps, the second in this 6-month series, where we're thinking about contemporary pilgrimage, how it intersects with walking, art, climate activism, and the ways we move through and relate to land today. Pilgrimage is something that's been practiced for millennia. It's so essential to our experience of being human. Where we can experience the more than human. And this is a pan-cultural thing across cultures, across continents, and yet it's also evolving in really interesting ways. So we're going to keep things quite open and conversational this evening as we collectively dive into this amazing subject area. And I'll invite each of the speakers. Oh, if you could just turn all of your mics on mute, if possible, because I'm getting some feedback. So just give you a minute to do that. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to invite each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to a series of short presentations where each speaker is going to present for about 5, 6, 7 minutes, and then after that we'll come together. So the speakers will come together for a short a panel conversation, and then we'll open things up to you all as well. I'm sure there's so many questions, so many thoughts, experiences that will likely be reflected back to us all. So feel free to in the meanwhile share your thoughts or questions in the chat as we go along. Just really briefly, and I'll hand over. We're joined by a wonderful group this evening. Jolie, Rose, Jonathan, Roxana, each bringing a different perspective on pilgrimage, walking, and practice. In our earlier conversations, a few threads really stood out. Last month, questions around land and its histories, walking as both an individual and collective act, the role of community as witness, and how pilgrimage is being reshaped in the context of environmental and climate concerns. So rather than trying to define pilgrimage too tightly, we're holding it open tonight, and or this morning or this afternoon, as something lived, practiced, and perhaps even contested. So to begin, I'll invite each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves. And yeah, so Jonathan?
Hello. Yeah, so I'm Jonathan. I'm based in Edinburgh. I'm mostly a socially engaged artist, a curator, and I'd say a peer educator, really. And walking is something I do and practice.
Hiya, my name's Jolie. I sort of discovered pilgrimage just before the lockdown, and it changed my life. It's changed my life in a myriad of ways. And yeah, I now lead long journeys. I walk normally about 500 miles across the UK, either horizontally or vertically, either on my own or leading groups. And yeah, it's something I've done 5 times now.
Hi, I'm Roxana Perez-Mendez. I'm Associate Professor of Art here at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I'm a Puerto Rican artist and half a member of Campo Arts, Campo Research Studios. And so I also lead walks on the Camino de Santiago as a utilizing pilgrimage as a medium. And I've been leading groups for about 7 years now, both through the academic and leading individuals on a artistic academic retreat.
With introductions all done, I think, yeah, I'll hand over to sorry, Jolie.
I entitled this Walking with Autumn because that is when I always walk. It's something that I came to, pilgrimage is something that I came to by my first experience, which was in 2018, when I walked with Extinction Rebellion from Brighton to London, when we shut down London and camped out at Hyde Park, which was an incredible experience. And one of the things that I discovered from that journey was that you could traverse the UK without avoiding urban environments, and that was something that I'd never quite registered before. I was aware of footpaths and sort of knew that, I knew about footpaths, and I enjoyed going walking in the countryside, but I didn't realize that we were so lucky as to have a whole network of footpaths that meant that you could actually cross England, or for this one to get from Brighton to London without going through urban environments. And that blew my mind. And it also blew my mind when we got to London and we closed down Hyde Park, how quickly the birds and the animals came back and how peaceful the city became. And it just showed me how powerful pilgrimage is. And Charlotte Pulver, who can't be here today, sadly, took us on an incredible pilgrimage through London, where she showed us all the sacred sites of what she called the ceremonial route, where people who were getting coronated, the kings and queens being coronated, would be led along, and took us to all these sacred sites through London. And it changed the landscape of London into this sacred landscape where I could see how it used to be before the city was there, and what these sites were and how it was so powerful. And it made me realize how powerful the land was beneath us, and therefore how the city kind of reflected the power of the land. And that was a different way of thinking about things that this pilgrimage introduced me to. And it made me realize that I definitely wanted to walk more, and it was something that I was planning to do. And then COVID happened. And during COVID, I was in a first floor flat with a husband that was a sort of falling apart relationship. And one of my best friends died, and we couldn't go to his funeral, and we couldn't be with each other to mourn. And it was a really horrible process, feeling like we were in prison all of a sudden. And when the lockdown lifted in the summer of 2020, I knew I had to get out, and I knew I had to be in nature. And so I planned a route, and I just went on the British Pilgrimage Trust's website, just looking for as long a route as I could. And I found the Michael Way, which was along a ley line, and I knew nothing about, I mean, I'd heard of ley lines, but I knew nothing about them. And I just was like, yeah, this sounds good, because it's a really long journey. It went from Cornwall all the way to East Anglia, which is where I'm from. So it was like, oh, this is that's nice. I'll end like at home. And it also talks about the Michael and the Mary lines, and how these were these two energy lines that interwove around the ley line, which is a line drawn with a ruler through sacred sites by a human. But you then go dowsing with dowsing rods, and you douse you just douse what's there. And there's a book called The Sun and the Serpent, and that was written in the late 70s. And these two guys, Hamish Miller, and I always forget the other guy's name, but they went dowsing with their dowsing rods, and they got halfway across the country before they realized there were two lines and not one. And so they had to start again, and they found these two lines, and they named them Michael and Mary after the churches that they passed through, because most of the sacred sites along that route are called Michael, and there's like 122 churches dedicated to Mary, and the lines kind of interweave through them. And these lines I knew nothing about before I set off. I just thought, well, that sounds interesting. And Brexit had just happened, and we just had COVID, and it felt like the country was in half, like we'd broken in half and we'd become separated from each other. And it felt like this weaving of the masculine and feminine, to me, felt a bit like stitching back up the country, and sort of an act of bringing us back together again. So when I set off, I did feel like that intention was there, which is what for me made it different to just going on a walk, because it wasn't like a fitness thing. It wasn't a just a nice idea. It was something deeper than that, that I wanted to connect with the land. I needed some time to heal, and I felt like being in the land was going to help me do that. But I also felt like it was going to be an act of healing in itself towards the land, that I was, you know, walking this particular route. So I walked 500 miles on my own. In the first week, my ex-husband split up with me. So I then was also kind of healing as I walked. This is the line that goes through all the sites. And although it was harrowing, it was actually a really interesting way to kind of get over a relationship, because there was no way of hiding. I couldn't go to work and distract myself. I couldn't go socialize with my friends. I just had to deal with my emotions like solidly for 7 weeks. And I became so in love with the plants who I felt were looking after me. So hawthorn, I knew already was a heart medicine, and I was eating the hawthorn berries because it was autumn, and I was nibbling on the hawthorn berries, and I just felt like the hawthorn was looking after me and supporting me. And so was the nettle, and so was the damsons, and so was the ivy and the brambles and the blackberries, and they just became my friends. And that's changed my whole experience of the natural world. When I enter a forest now, it's like I'm going into a party full of people I know, and I really love seeing them and enjoy being with them. And as I was walking the pilgrimage on my own, it started to emerge to me that it felt like I was in a performance, because I kept meeting all these incredible people, like everyone I met, and they were from all walks of life, different age groups, different cultural backgrounds, different social economic backgrounds, who I never would have met from my world in Brighton. I'd lived in Brighton for 20 years, and it's a wonderful liberal place, but I never met like Catholic old ladies who run B&Bs, or landed gentry, or, you know, people from all different walks of life that I met. And yeah, a fox hunter. I stayed with a fox hunter, and I stayed with a dairy farmer, and they all put me up and they all looked after me. And it became a story. And as I was walking, I was telling the people I met how incredible the people I'd already met have been. And then they were doing incredible things, and they became part of the story. So everyone was audience. And then they also then became characters within the play that was unfolding. And I realized also I was like a walking confessional. So the two archetypes that I felt the pilgrim archetypes are is the hermit. So you're walking with your stuff, like I was walking with my grief and my relationship and everything. But I was also the fool, because everything was my favorite thing. Sometimes I was sleeping in a ditch, and sometimes I was sleeping in a 4-poster bed. And whatever was happening, it was extraordinary, and I was having an amazing time. And so one of my friends, Anna, who is the lady with the curly hair sitting on the floor next to me in this photo, came and joined me for the end of the walk, and I told her about this experience, and she said, well, why don't you come to COP26? Because she works there as a delegate. She'd been going there for years, and she said, I think it'd be amazing to walk to COP26 and to develop something that you present there. And I said, well, let's do it. Let's create a performance that we take to COP26. So I put the word out, and it ended up being like 26 people said yes, they wanted to come with me. That's them setting off from London with me. And it actually ended up being about 30 of us by the time we got there. It grew in numbers. And I was looking for a route. And when I was looking for the route, I found another ley line. So this one's called the Spine of Albion. And it starts in the Isle of Wight and goes all the way to the top of Scotland. And I just instantly felt like I wanted to walk another ley line. Like it just felt like I'd tuned into something with the lines previously, and that I felt like they looked after me. And I could kind of tell when I was on them and when I wasn't on them. And I knew that that might be just in my head, but still it was something that I'd experienced. And I was interested to see if I walked other lines, whether they would be different. And this one's called The Spine of Albion, which is the name of the book that it's from. And this was a couple who wrote this more recently, I think probably in the 2000s. And they had also dowsed and found 2 energy lines interweaving, and they called them Ellen and Belenus, which are named after the Celtic, sort of the equivalent of Apollo and Artemis. And I instantly was like, yeah, I want to walk that. So although I'd already arranged with people that I'd meet them in London, I actually started in the Isle of Wight, did a walk up to Winchester, then went over to London, picked everyone up. We walked along the Ridgeway to Uffington, to Dragon Hill, and then we walked up the Spine of Albion until we got to Edinburgh, and then we went across to Glasgow. And we decided to plan where we felt like the chakra points were along the spine, and we held a ceremony in each point of the chakra points. And that ended up feeling like a more important piece of work almost than what we were taking to COP, because we knew, yeah, it's an amazing thing to take something to COP, but we knew we probably weren't going to change the world with a performance at COP, as much as that would be a lovely thing to achieve. But it just felt like we were doing something with the earth and for the earth, in relationship to the earth, that felt so important. And so we held a ceremony at each of the chakra points, and we invited a local wisdom keeper from each location to join us and hold the ceremony, but also tell us about the land we were on, and kind of embed us in the landscape and the mythology, and just, yeah, connect us with where we were. And we also connected with each of those chakras within ourselves, you know, as we walked. And as we went, we also like tuned into the land. This is actually at Charlotte's workshop, which was at the end. When we landed at COP, we stayed in Kelburn Castle, which is an incredible castle covered in graffiti that's just outside of Glasgow. And the Lord of Glasgow said that we could stay there. I think, well, maybe it's the Lord of Edinburgh. I can't remember, one of the two. But he lived there in this castle, and he let us stay, which was amazing. And we did a series of workshops and events up there. And one of them was Charlotte coming and holding this yew tree immersion, and it was wonderful. It was a, yeah, I mean, we all had fallen in love with the yew trees already on the journey, but we connected with the yew trees in this incredible workshop that she held. And as we walked, we created a performance, and it was based on trying to perform what we were experiencing as we walked the land. And amongst us, there were lots of different types of practitioners. Quite a few of us are fools, because that's the theatre technique that I was trained in, was fooling. So we were used to improvising and working with the audience and becoming things. So that's us becoming a dragon. That's the Greek being a dragon in this image, and really just trying to capture what it was like to walk the land. So as we made our performance, we got to COP, and people were like talking about how we walked through the wind, and it was like walking into 45 degrees because the wind was so strong, and we'd lean forward and someone would hold us at 45 degrees, and then someone else would flap our coat behind us, and then people would like hold onto our feet and be the mud that had clagged to our boots that we were having to drag across the grounds. And so it's, yeah, it was nice to try and actually share the embodied experience of what had happened as we'd walked. And we took that to the green zone and we performed that at COP, which was wonderful. And instead of having a banner, which we unfurled at the we did a kind of march into Glasgow and into COP at the beginning with all the other pilgrimages that had walked there. And instead of having a banner that just said one thing, we collected the thoughts and hopes of all the people that we met on our journey, and we sewed them all onto a banner. So there was like 350 or something voices that we put on this banner. And our question was, what do you want us to say to the delegates at COP? And that was what we marched into Glasgow with. So off the back of that,
Jolie, just time check, just a minute or two left, because I think we're running, just to stick to time.
I'll go quickly. So off the back of this, we developed a mummers play of George and the Dragon, because we wanted to be like travelling players, which is something that I used to do as a child and still do today at this Tudor reenactment. And so we took that on a pilgrimage back along the Michael and Mary line as a group of travelling players. And we always stop at Dragon Hill, which is where the lines cross in Uffington and Winchester. And then we did it again back down the Spine of Albion. This one we made up ourselves rather than a traditional mummers play. This one was about King Arthur, we wrote ourselves. And then we just walked the Pilgrimage for Peace, which was back along the Michael and Mary line again. And next year, and that was George and the Dragon. And next year, we're going to be walking the Athena and Apollo lines, which is going towards Israel, to a place called Armageddon, which is in Israel. We're going to have to do this in chunks because it's 4,500 miles. So yeah, that's what we're doing next. There you go.
Okay, I could pick up on. I'm not going to. I'm going to sort of read something I wrote today, just to stick to script, but I could pick up lots of resonance with what we've just heard. But I'll just tell you, I'm going to focus just on a project called Pilgrimage for COP26. These slides aren't necessarily in order, but I'll flick through them occasionally. So Pilgrimage for COP26 was very simple. It was an open invitation to walk from Dunbar on the east coast of Scotland to Glasgow as a precursor for COP26. The walk took place over 10 days in October 2021, with 4 days spent engaging with people in Edinburgh. Much of our walk braided the John Muir Way, although we deviated whenever a more interesting route presented itself. Give or take, we maintained a core group of about 20 to 25 walkers, so that's people staying overnight, as it were, continuous through the walk, with additional walkers joining us each day, and again, more participants joining us for specific events. I'll say more about those in a moment. There were three stated aims for the walk, framed in response to the question, why are we walking? Those aims were stated as follows. We're walking to raise awareness of the climate and ecological crisis. We're reflecting on that crisis as it relates to our own lives, the communities we pass through, and the lives of those already impacted, both human and more than human. And we're building a community of witness and resistance committed to climate justice now and in the wake of COP26. The emphasis on climate justice now was key. Oh, I should be flicking through these. That's us outside John Muir birthplace on the first day. That's gathering more people as we move through with our walking guide for the day, Duncan Smead. This is us passing through a threshold to really begin the pilgrimage, as it were. And again, this is us moving through. So the emphasis on climate justice now was key. We weren't walking to Glasgow with a set of agreed demands and the expectation that anyone would grant them, something that other groups were actively engaged in, taking certain demands to Glasgow. Instead, we were gathering as a temporary community, learning from one another and the places we walked through, with the aim of putting that learning into practice after COP26, whatever the outcome of the summit. As with all pilgrimages worthy of their name, there was a hope that something transformative would happen, that the person who set out on the journey would be somehow inwardly changed, clarified in their intention, reinvigorated by their commitment, returning to their home ground with a more active sense of hope. These are some of we regularly met with people. Let me just skip back briefly. So pilgrimages are often framed in a kind of, Victor Turner would frame it in a sort of liminal context. You step away from the everyday and you move into this liminal space betwixt and between. But actually for us, the pilgrimage was very much about getting to know our bioregion, getting to know the people, their concerns, and also getting to know the history and the climate history of that place. That's Berwick Law in the distance now. So the intention was to return to our home ground with a more active sense of hope. The pilgrimage also offered a programme of public events, a launch event with Northlight Arts in Dunbar, the closing event with the Pilgrims Procession in Glasgow, which has just been mentioned. That was to inaugurate civil society actions around COP26. And between these events, other workshops, talks, community choirs, a film screening, a deep time walk, a climate ceilidh, and various other things were woven through the pilgrimage. I'll just go through some of these slides to get a sense of some of the landscape. This is Grangemouth. So we were walking through, very beautiful landscapes and camping in these landscapes sometimes, and also going through places with very obvious climate impact. Grangemouth is a refinery, been a refinery for 100 years, actually stopped being a refinery in 2025. We can say a bit more about that in terms of just transitions or their absence. This is the watershed on our way into Glasgow. As I say, we're very interested in bioregionalism and just looking at the natural environments that are very specific to a locality, very distinctly different from the East Coast where we set off. I'll come back to these sorts of images in the conversation, but we were walking with a number of artists. So Natalie Taylor here, this was called the Keepers of the Soil. It was a cape, and in this picture outside Scottish Parliament, Natalie's taking a soil sample. In that cape, there are various pockets, and we gathered and were gifted soil from across the region, which we then looked into for various reasons. To ensure that the widest range of participants could join us, a lot of upfront work was put into the pilgrimage. We organised places to stay, food to eat, an electric van to transport our bags and bedding, and a pilgrim guide for each leg of the journey. Once that was in place, all we needed to do was walk. So this is Keepers of the Soil, one of the artworks. This is we walked with stitches for survival as well. These fabric art projects, which we gathered en route, and then they were displayed across Glasgow. We also worked with Ali Pretty, the Beach of Dream flags. That we walked with those, and they became integral to the final procession into Glasgow. That's one of those here. We also worked with this is the Serpent of Capitalism, with Zoe Walker and Neil Bromwich, to again bring a bit of critique, not just celebration, to that final walk into Glasgow. I'm thinking about what's actually in front of me in these images, and actually getting distracted from my text. So I'll go back to my text. Curiously, it was this sense of background support of the work we'd put in up front to the pilgrimage that struck the deepest chord with many of the participants. People, predominantly from a secular background, seemed overwhelmed by the generosity of those who hosted us, often across different demographics of faith, class, and race. On numerous occasions, I was asked, why are they being so generous? Why are we even being hosted? I won't say more about that sense of gift giving here, but I planted as a seed for later discussion, perhaps. This is Earth Holders. So we did quite a lot of work with different faith groups en route. We walked with them. They always hosted us. They provided food. Edinburgh Interfaith Climate Justice walk, visiting various religious buildings and hearing more about their scriptures, and as importantly, perhaps more importantly, their first-hand experience of climate change directly themselves or with family in the global south. Often hosted at churches, Episcopal churches, en route, invariably feasted by, this is the Glasgow Gurdwara, by different faith communities, Sikh and Muslim communities in particular, often offered food. On some occasions we had a lot of, if you like, civic engagement in the pilgrimage. Sometimes they were just the core group, let's say 30 folk, walking through a landscape. This is again outside Parliament in Scotland. There's the electric vehicle. That's I think that's a very wet day. The final day, we're going to start walking into Glasgow.
Jonathan, just giving you time check if there's any.
That's cool. So I'll just go through some of those images. Very much about community building, people joining us spontaneously, the folk involved. So finally, I want to end by quoting my friend David G, who walked with the pilgrimage for the last 5 days. Sadly, David died in 2024, but before he died, he wrote a book called Wildest Dream, an imagined history of the Green Man, in which he reflects on the pilgrimage for COP26 and other countercultural ecological initiatives. So this is the quote. I'd sooner cast my lot with these motley movements of hope than with the kind of hope that expects to seize the future and save the world. Such total hope, trading in grand narratives of redemption and hungering as it does for just a little more power to realise them, forever slips from the fist that gropes for it. The kind of hope is lost in the flood. What we're left with is to make our cares manifest here and now. Let the life that moves around us move within us. Resist the violence as well as we can, and let the future come This may be exactly where the greening leads, no more and no less. Where it begins is right here, under the darkening sky, in the company of the curlew and the lichen and each other. So that's enough for now. Thank you.
Wow. What was your colleague's name?
David G.
David G.
David G. Yeah, I put it in the
Thank
chat.
you. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. That's so beautiful. Yeah, on which note I think we're going to segue into our final presentation before we enter the discussion.
Again, my name is Roxana Perez-Mendez, Puerto Rican artist, and I want to begin where all honest walks begin, by naming ground. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I teach, sits on the land of El Caliche, the Shikori, the Emo, the Sepaha people. We begin, of course, cognizant of the contributions of enslaved and free Black who built and sustained our institution, and are grateful to Kenneth Lee, Floyd McKissick, and James Robert Walker, the first African-American students who set foot on our campus back in 1951. It was an act that took over 200 years to come to fruition. We also wish in our small way to acknowledge and recognize the sovereign First Nations, Indigenous peoples globally, and the legacy and longevity of Indigenous knowledge that traverse and transcend disciplines that we in the West often refer to as philosophy, aesthetics, or ethics, intellectual technologies that have been discovered in discourse, knowingly or unknowingly recreated as our own. And so, but in one way, but I want to be clear that for me, this is not a formality, the first political act of the day, as it were, because the land is never neutral, and that is not a poetic statement, it's a historical one. And so for the past decade, I worked collaboratively with Mario Marsan as Campo Research Studio, using walking as a method of research, socially engaged performance, and education, and using long distance pilgrimages across Europe and the Americas. And for our most sustained practice has been on the Camino de Santiago, where we run a walking artist residency called Drawing the Camino that follows the footsteps of our study abroad program that spanned 5 years at the University of North Carolina. This program is open to artists, individuals at any stage of practice, but we intentionally prioritize Black, Latin American, Indigenous, Asian, gender diverse, neuro-enabled diverse participants. And we believe that access to nature is not a luxury, it is climate justice. Now, I want to begin with a storm. The ecological crisis, as Martin Luther philosopher Malcolm Ferdinand argues in the decolonial ecology, is not primarily a crisis of nature. It is a crisis of justice, one that did not begin with the rising sea or intensifying storms, but rather with the plantation, with the colonial reorganization of land, labor, and living systems across 5 centuries. And when Hurricane Maria slow walked across Puerto Rico in September 2017, in a perfect diagonal, it did not arrive as an aberration. It arrived as capitalism, as a consequence. It exposed what Naomi Klein calls as the residue of this kind of disaster capitalism. The infrastructure of dispossession, the deliberate underdevelopment of colonial territory, what Beatriz Yanin Figueroa describes as the persistence of failure of conceptual imagination and ethical will to change. This is where Campo Research Studio begins. not in the beauty of the walk, but in fact in the weight of the ground. And to think from the Caribbean, from an island, from the diaspora, from what Edouard Glissant calls the condition of the tout monde, is to think relationally, archipelagic rather than continental, not from the fixed center, but outward, from the open, the porous, the mutually constituted space between bodies of water and land. Edward Camus Braithwaite extends this to the oceanic, the submarine, the routes of the Middle Passage, as an alternative cartography of belonging, one that the dominant map, colonial and terrestrial bounded, has always tried to erase, fluid and in flow. Our pilgrimage practice works within this tradition to walk slowly, to attune the body to the electromagnetic frequency of granite, to forage, to draw and listen and practice what Maya Jinka feminist artist Lorena Cabnal calls the cuerpo territorio, knowing that begins in and through the body, that refuses the extractive separation of researcher from research, and insists that the land is not a background, but an inculator. So whose land is this? Well, there are three questions that we bring to every walk, and they're not rhetorical. They are the method. Paulo Freire's notions thinks about the process of developing critical consciousness through engagement of lived reality. And that doesn't happen in the classroom. And on the Camino at the 14.5 kilometer border that is crossing, that is the invisible border between France and Spain, it happens in the body, in the ground, mid-step. So to walk a sacred route is to enter a relationship with everything that has happened in the land before your arrival, including its violences, its erasures, its unresolved claims. For those walking from Puerto Rico to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean diaspora, from communities whose relationship to land has been defined by dispossession rather than inheritance, this accountability is not abstract. It is the very substance of the walk. And so the walker who does not read the history of the ground beneath their feet is not a pilgrim. They are a tourist. This distinction is not one of intention or devotion, but of accountability. The pilgrim submits to transformation by the land they cross. The tourist consumes it, passing through without being changed by what the ground holds. The distinction may be difficult to feel from within the long European or perhaps Western tradition, where sacred routes, the Camino, the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury, all of them have largely been walked by those whose relationship to land was one of belonging, of not being displaced by it. When the ground beneath your feet has historically been yours to walk freely, the question of whose land it is can recede into the landscape. For those whom that question has never been settled, whose ancestral land was mapped, renamed, extracted, and governed by others, it cannot recede. It is present in every step. And so on Vale, northern Spain, dolmen on the Camino, we have 5 granite stones worn soft over millennia. They're keepers of the dead, or so that meaning consciousness could eternally flourish. We ask people we walk with, what memories of those who passed do you carry with you today? And so I ask all of us that similar question, but maybe slightly in a different register, because there's a fundamental asymmetry at the heart of contemporary climate pilgrimage that I think we need to name. When walkers from the West, US, Britain, Europe, take to ancient routes in the name of peace, water, ecological justice, they do so largely as inheritors of the land, of the infrastructure, of the political and economic systems that their nations built through the very extraction and dispossession that they now mourn. To walk for the climate while declining to account for how your country's colonial history produced the conditions that climate crisis is not, in my mind, activism. It is, as Freire would recognize, a form of false generosity, the oppressor extending care to the consequences of harm while remaining unaccountable to its causes. Malcolm Ferdinand is precise. The ecological crisis and colonial crisis are not parallel problems. They are the same problem. To this is what we call in Campo's practice social naturopathy. Pilgrimage engages directly in the territorio pueblo to release its social flows and encourage the social body to heal itself. But I want to ask that we be honest about what the healing requires. For most privileged to walk, the pilgrimage route offers a form of spiritual preparation that costs nothing materially and demands nothing politically. The walk becomes self-transformative without being structurally transformative. The land they walk was never taken from them. The water they breathe was never poisoned for profit. And so the pilgrimage, however sincere, can function as a space that feels radical but leaves the underlying arrangements of power entirely intact. But until accountability enters the room, no conversation about sacred steps, climate, or ecological healing is complete. Solidarity without accountability is not solidarity, it's aesthetics.
I'm just doing a quick time check now, and yeah.
Thank you. So, but if we talk and walk honestly with open hands on the land we've learned to read, which I acknowledge my colleagues here on this panel have all that. That is what Campo Research Studios practice attempts, not to walk away from history, but to walk against it, inside it. To treat the body moving through the land as a site of reckoning, not just a site of healing. Because healing without reckoning is not healing. It's forgetting with good intentions. Thank you.
I could listen to you all, like it's such a hard work to cut you all off. So much to learn and to deepen. So I guess we could use this just a panel section before we the panel discussion before we enter into the chat to really maybe deepen into some of those shared experiences. And I think, you know, there's something really present throughout all three of your talks around presence, I think, and in the contemporary nature of these pilgrimages and addressing those structural, historic, ecological constraints, or however we want to call them, inside the work that you're all doing and undoing at the same time. So I feel like maybe this is just a chance maybe to ask each other a question, or to further delve into that idea of being present rather than rather than walking for a future self or for a past self. I think that was coming through for me. I'm just going to shut up and maybe pass the mic to you guys.
Maybe I could pick that up and ask Roxana a question. So I'm interested in this distinction between self-transformation and, if you like, structure. You know, something that's structurally transformative. On the pilgrimage for COP26, you know, people walked for their own reasons, but I was very clear myself that the intention was to come back to your place and make, if you like, structural changes, without being grandiose about that. I mean, structural changes might be, you know, planting an orchard, creating a food co-op, these sorts of things. Roxana, what do you mean by structural changes that are coming from walking land?
Well, I go back to what, okay, that was muted for a second. I go back to the place of Lorna Carnal, you know, as the cuerpo territorio, that in a way, you know, looking at it through the lens of from the south, in the south, or from the Americas up, from the, you know, even from the US, where John Muir's, form of conservation actually evolved as a result of dispossessing millions of people from their land, indigenous people from their land. And so while there's things to commemorate with him, there is actually great, grief and pain that's attached to his legacy that we don't always acknowledge. And so the structural change is essentially the if you can't acknowledge what you have, the start is necessarily just starting with the acknowledgement of where the roots of all our changes lie. We tend to point to others as the source of the problem, and we take on our small little grain of sand, and that is all that we can do. I'm a firm believer that we need more than just hope, and we need more than just careful planned walks. What we need, and many of you have been generated through your practice, is form of action that endures beyond the walk. We each are transforming the self. We are each a form of sculpture, in a way that when we engage in the act of walking, we're a performer in the act of performance. But the object, in the end, when we're thinking about like what it is, where does the aesthetic lie of this practice? We think about it in terms of like whether the picture presents itself well. Did they go back? We don't know if they made the orchard or not. There's hope, and I think that as you might have said earlier at our conversation, that we need to have more than just hope. We're at a point of needing action, and for people who are losing their land to water, and the rates of our insurance goes up, especially in the US, due to endless fires and floods, and now we're raining bombs on others around the world. I think that there is a certain kind of emergency that line. I don't know if that answered your question.
Something I'd like to ask you as well, Roxana, is when you're walking the walks that you have done, is there an emotional connection with the land specifically from yourself or the people that you're walking with? And tell me a little bit about that, if that is part of kind of how you plan it.
Yeah, our walks are various. I think in some practices we uncover, in Campo's practice, we uncover our connection to the walk while we're there, and in others we have it from the start. The Camino was something that I had done in my name, and very similar to you. It was, as a first experience, it was something that was transformative. I had no idea what it was and how powerful it was. I was walking through a moment of grief myself, and subsequently have walked what I would call dark pilgrimages, essentially walking in the name of someone who has passed under unfortunate circumstances. And so I find that my historical background, or genealogical background, cannot be subdivided from a nexus of three areas: that from Spain, that from the indigenous and Taino in Puerto Rico, and those who crossed the Middle Passage in Africa. And so having those direct genes, grains of seeds to follow is what leads me to for us to kind of engage on these various landscapes. You know, there are ones that feel familiar, and I think that's something really powerful that I wasn't expecting, and that you know, in a space where you can feel foreign, or you're continuously feeling displaced, or space is not your own, or something's been overwritten upon you, kind of. You know, I think I appreciate Bad Bunny right now because he's kind of, in a way, kind of superimposing, rewriting on top of this kind of blanket of United States ownership that kind of permeates our existence. So, yes, there is an emotional landscape that is definitely part of the work. And very similar to you, I think there's a kind of something that is deeper, that is exercised within us while we engage. And the same is true for our participants who come along with us.
Jolie, can I ask you a question about hosting, being hosted? Because again, I think that's something we had a sort of resonance with. Could you just say something about, you know, the random gift of what it means to be hosted, and also what the pilgrim brings to the host? I think this kind of where these energies meet is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's the thing that I'd say it's probably kind of had the biggest, well, I couldn't even say that actually, but it's one of the things that's had a really big effect on me. I think, yeah, like I say, I spent 20 years living in Brighton, and it's the same type of people who live there. It's a very liberal, left-wing place where we're all on the same page. And the thing that just astounded me from the start, and it's run through every pilgrimage I've walked, is that people from completely different backgrounds will take you in and connect with you. And the biggest thing I took away from the first pilgrimage was that we were all scared. We were all in grief. We were all doing our best. We were just trying to muddle our way through. No one knew what was going on, and everyone lived in a completely different reality. Like literally everyone I stayed with, I was like, God, if you guys actually told each other what you think reality is, like the fact we even vaguely cobble something together is quite incredible. And there's an archetypal energy that the pilgrim has where people do really respond to you. I feel like it is that we know what a pilgrim is, even though it's a bit like the fool. It's the same with the fool. We sort of know what a fool is without, if you actually try and say what, you know, pin down what a fool is, it's like, oh, and it's the same with the pilgrim. But people just seem to know. And yeah, I definitely felt like a walking confessional. People will just tell you their stuff and they'll open up to you because you're a stranger. But will show such kindness. And I think there's an element of you being in a place of vulnerability where people will support you and take you in and care for you. And it's almost like it's the amount that they can do is almost a gift to themselves of like how much they can do. Like it feels like a sacred act to be giving what you can. And I feel it the other way around, you know, like what's it called? I've forgotten the word, but Zeus, it was a sacred act for Zeus to be a good host. I can't remember what the word is. I want to say hernia, but it's not hernia. Something like that. Xenia, maybe Xenia. But to worship Zeus was to be a good host. And I think we kind of lost that in the UK, especially, or probably Europe. That it's, I didn't see what they're saying. That with the Black Death and the plague, we stopped being so welcoming to strangers and we started to be a bit more fearful of strangers. But it feels almost like the pilgrimage in this day and age, and the first one I walked was through a plague, it was through COVID, and the fact people were still so kind to me and still let me in and stay in their properties and, you know, camp in their gardens and stuff was incredible, because that was a real act of bravery. They didn't have to do that. But yeah, it feels like it harkens back to this like earlier time where we welcomed in strangers and we wanted to hear their story and we wanted to hear news from down the road and share our stories with each other. And yeah, it just changed my view of humanity completely, actually. What about you? What was your experience with that, Jonathan?
Well, I suppose my experience is that I was brought up within a Christian context. You know, that can be heard in lots of different directions, but essentially, where there are all sorts of people from all sorts of classes and all sorts of backgrounds, trying to sort of practice some love economy. So it wasn't a heavy-handed context. So I was kind of shocked by the idea that people didn't know that, you know, in a way, I came up squarely against quite how secularized my, if you like, my climate anarchist colleagues were. And I mean, you know, they can speak for themselves, but my sense was they had no sense of what a gift economy was. That actually people had been individualized and marketized in their very engagement around how we might engage with issues around social justice and ecology. So I found that I found their surprise about why people would be generous, often coming from religious contexts, you know, whether it's the Sikh community, the Muslim community, Christian community. I think that was a real eye opener for people. And in terms of how we respond to issues around the climate crisis and the sort of violence that is both present and more so coming our way, I think that's a real, you know, well, just to repeat the word, that's a real gift, that there is actually a kind of generosity that is not fully accounted for by capitalist colonial mindsets. So yeah, and I think there is something about the, as you say, the role of the pilgrim who is to some extent vulnerable and searching. They are between spaces. They have this liminal identity that, yeah, it allows people to be other than they normally are in their everyday life, I think, you know, in the sense of the host. And you know,
I'm gonna ask you all a question maybe, and I think it is just tying in this sense of anti-capitalist, decolonial kind of approach to thinking about pilgrimage, but also this borderless journey that you're making in many senses, the bioregionalism that you spoke about as well, Jonathan, thinking about the land in a different way, thinking about, when you mentioned, Jolie, the London in a different way, looking at it pre all of these layers. You're looking at kind of water bodies and plants before those structures came on. And yeah, also what you were mentioning, Roxana, about the alternative cartographies of belonging. And I think that in a sense is really an important touch note, especially linking to what you were talking about, Jonathan, in terms of climate justice. And for me, I'm really wanting to learn a little bit about bringing those people in who have for so long been excluded from the land or from walking in general, and just thinking if you could talk a little bit to that.
I guess I could talk a little bit about I think one of the things that we asked is, how walking in this kind of pilgrimage path ends in a kind of a physical, emotional transformation. But looking at it through, the lens that I'm kind of superimposing, in a way, if the walk itself doesn't change, then you're just doing kind of a statement, we're still, in a way, sailing in the kind of ship that Ferdinand mentioned as a kind of like intellectual ship. We're still crossing, we're still moving, we're still, going through a liminal space, leaving and arriving. but the nothing about the fact of what's happened has changed. So I'll just stop there. Just tossing little things.
I don't know quite how to answer the question other than to say that in this specific context, we've sort of met with people who, you know, live in a place, sometimes work that land. I mean, I'm interested in people's relationship to land as a form of labour, really. Actually, I'm not. So one of the interesting things on the route that we took is that it's essentially post-industrial. So you've got a lot of mining cultures which have been having been closed down, and then you've got long-term unemployment. So you've got a kind of, and often people living in a place have actually no relationship to their geography, to their history. There's a sense of having had a meaningful work. It may be problematic work on lots of levels, but having had a meaningful culture, a meaningful life within mining, for example, mining cultures, and then essentially that being closed down by the state, and nothing provided. And I think that's interesting, that a person has actually been doubly extracted. They've been extracted then from their culture and extracted from any engagement with land and place. So that doesn't answer the question, but I was very interested in talking to people about how they can reconnect, in what ways they reconnect. And for us, that often came through agriculture. So that often came through conversations about people who are establishing smaller farms, social enterprises, different ways of re-engaging with the land in a very sort of tangible, growing food sense, really. And of course, that does have implications for issues around food sovereignty and sustainability.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think did you want to mention anything, Jolie, or should we open up to the chat?
Yeah, I was going to answer that as well, but should I?
Yeah.
We have so yeah, when on the first walk, I had some friends walk with me in the first week before I was on my own, and there was a couple of moments where they were like trying to change people's minds about things. Like we're talking about vaccinations with one family, and they had opposing views, and that kind of got a bit heated. And then we stayed with a fox hunter, and there was opposing views, and then that kind of got a bit heated. And someone talking about Brexit, and that got a bit, and it just got to a point where I was like, do you know what? I actually feel like in the role of pilgrim, that we're a walking confessional, that my job is to listen and not to be just marching across the land shouting my opinions at people, and I learned so much from listening, but also I think because someone felt heard, they kind of saw and received more stuff from me than they would have done if I'd just been like coming at them or attacking them. And so when we did the performative walks, we do a performance. So we do George and the Dragon, right? And it's the origin of the George and the Dragon cross, the St. George's cross, which is a sign of racism, and can be seen in many different ways in the UK. But just as in the last walk, Pilgrimage for Peace, that went up all the way across the UK just before we set off, and we're there performing George and the Dragon, and we've got St. George with the cross on it. And people were just really confused about what was happening, because it was obviously this folk performance, and it was the origin of where this cross comes from, but it wasn't that we were saying anything negative. And actually within this story, St. George comes a cropper and dies at the hands of the Saracen knight because he's not listening and because he's going around killing everybody, and so he then gets killed, and he gets brought back to life again by a herbalist. So like a kind of lefty quack doctor brings him back to life again. And it was just a creative offering that then started a conversation. And I felt like that was a gentler way, where we weren't saying anything particularly. It's just a creative offering that just gets people saying, what's that about, what you do, and even my favorite audience is walking through a village and some like housewives or kids coming home from school, or someone just seeing us and going, what? And their reality just going, oh god, the world isn't just the way I think it is. It's not just what we see on the telly. There's these weird people dressed as strange characters walking through a town. Like what are they? What's that? And that's my favorite kind of way of reaching people in a way.
Yeah, amazing perspectives. Yeah, in awe. Yeah, shall we open it up? I think Anne has a good question, and do you want me to read it out, Anne, or do you want to ask it yourself?
I can ask it. I was so in the last discussion, I don't know if all of you were there, but there was an interesting question that came up about the penitential aspect of pilgrimage. And in that session, it was sort of like, oh, well, that isn't really where we are as a culture right now. I felt like was kind of the answer. But in all of your descriptions, there was so much about grief and mourning, and especially with Roxana, this idea of acknowledging past wrongs and also being aware of our own complicity in that. And so I just was curious what you thought of the idea of penance, which was really important in medieval pilgrimage, as important to a sacred pilgrimage today. And maybe how would you define it? And is it transformative? I mean, just curious where you would put that word.
I'll go first for this one. My all of so I've done 5 walks, and 3 of them have been extremely tough. 2 were easier and 3 were extremely tough, and they were tough because of grief, because of relationship breakups, difficulties within the group that I was walking with, holding, so like the walk to COP, walking with and thinking about and holding climate crisis for 3 months, because it ended up being 3 months in total. Like, you know, it's one of those things you think about maybe once a day or whatever, how often you might think about it, but to just think about it pretty much all day every day for 3 months was grueling. And when I got to COP and found out that everyone, all the delegates, the main political delegates, had already left in their helicopters, you know, by the time we got there, I pretty much had a breakdown. You know, I totally collapsed and was broken from it. And the last pilgrimage I just walked was really tough as well, pilgrimage for peace, because we're walking and Greta Thunberg's getting bombed. We feel World War beginning. You know, we're walking through all of that, and you've got the George Cross, and I think that it's an important part of it. And this is just my own experience, but every time I do walk a really tough pilgrimage, incredible things open up in my life when I get back, and I'm not expecting it, but it's what has happened. It's something that I've observed has happened, and I don't know why or how or where that comes from, but it does feel pretty spiritual. It feels like it feels almost like a sacrifice that one makes, and something does come in to fill the space of that sacrifice. So yeah, it's had very profound effects on my life, which yeah, I live a completely different life now to the one that I lived 5 years ago when I began these walks.
Wow. Thank you.
My response to that is just to be aware of how loaded the term is, and how much sort of gender politics would be in there around, if we're thinking about the penitential role of pilgrimage in the medieval times and what that theology was about, a certain form of suffering, a certain form of penance. So I think actually maybe it's also, so I can use the word as sort of humbling, there's a sort of humility to listening. I want to say that there's a lightness, perhaps, for me personally, about the idea of being invited into pilgrimage. There's a kind of, as Jolie says, you know, not being anywhere with any answers or any certainty, but a kind of a walking, a learning, a recognizing how much I simply don't know, how much we don't know, how much we're gifted in being, in just listening to the land, listening to people, and joy. So actually, for me personally, I'd be more interested in what pilgrimage can offer us in terms of joy and humility and a lightness of touch, than penitence. Although, you know, I think, you know, I think what, you know, if one should be penitential, if one has a heavy load, then going for a walk is perhaps something that could be very, very beneficial, walking with that. But yeah, I would be cautious to bring that penitential aspect. Yeah.
I think about you know, the where the contemporary practice of penance factors in, and the most, interesting place of where it lands in the work that I do is in the question of what the walk demands of the walker in return for what the land gives. And some of the walks that we do when we're looking at dolmens, this idea of keepers of the dead, the meaning of this kind of consciousness, we ask, what memories of those who passed do you carry with you today? And, that is, a penitential question. It asks the walker to arrive carrying something, not just their body or the intention of the weight of but what the weight of what they owe to the person who has passed. The dead who built the university, the dead who crossed the Middle Passage, the dead who cleared the land for contemporary walkers to call wilderness, the dead whose names the Camino overwrites. So it enters when the walk is no longer about what the walker receives. It's about the transformation, the communitas, the healing, but about what maybe in a way what the walker owes. So the land is asking something in return. And if you aren't hearing it, I'll tell you that we have. The stones that everyone wants down, that there is I don't know, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank
I
you.
can
That was
go to
good. Those were all wonderful ways of looking at it. Thank you.
I'll read the question out, as I think there might be a bit of an issue. So the question in the chat is, how is the moving bodily presence related to the kindness, confessions, etc.? I know we're here with walking artists talking about pilgrimage. I'm curious about whether there are words to capture what people you/we meet walking are responding to. Do you have anything to add? I think your mic's on.
Hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I want to say thank you. I'm an anthropologist, and it's just been so refreshing listening to you talk about pilgrimage rather than reading all the things about liminal and la-di-da-di-da. So a second question has cropped up listening, but I'll try and talk about my first one again. So like you spoke about how, of course, beforehand, the pilgrim would bring information, like in times before social media. I'm curious about how there's also something about social cohesion in the pilgrim. And I think, Jolie, you were speaking to this most clearly, like the spiritual or, bigger picture of it, that what the walking body and the specific sort of pilgrim walking body brings is something about a bigger connective tissue between humans and potentially humans and more than humans. But that's like, maybe we'll just speak about the humans for now. So I'm curious about, what you think about that idea. And the second question that has come up is listening now to this exchange on penance. And last year I had an experience where a sort of wise elder lady made me suffer horribly. I was completely distraught and crying. And then I spoke to somebody about this, and they were like, well, Dutta, that's just a classic sort of ordeal being initiated by an elder. And we got into a discussion about how or whether that's an old way of doing things, like this idea of suffering to, if you like, yeah, to be initiated, and whether it's possible, and this is how it connects with this idea of we are all connected already, and we are embedded, we are part of a network, which is definitely human, and whether that's actually something, talking about COP and talking about climate activism and the future of humanity, whether we still need to do the suffering and the ordeal and the pilgrimage understood as that. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that all made sense to me. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because I think the fooling training that I've done brought a lot of my understanding of what was happening to the party, because I had a very painful teacher. He some people might have heard of Goulier, the clown teacher. He's the same ilk and era of my teacher, which is Jonathan Kay, and he's softened a lot in recent years, and has become a much gentler teacher. And there's parts of me that when I am in the workshops or groups with him now and I see how he's being, I'm like, oh, you lucky people. He's been so much nicer to you guys than he was to us. And there's a part of me that feels that I got a deeper, or like he really got in there in a way that he's maybe not doing so much now. So like I appreciate the fact that I got put through that. And it's the same as what I was saying about with these different pilgrimages as well, because the two that were softer and I got away with more and I had less physical ailment and I had less traumatic experience doing, can't really remember that much about them. Like really can't remember that much about them.
Okay.
The three that were difficult were the most transformative. So I don't know. I feel like I always sort of use the analogy of a tent. Like the material's the good times, but it's the poles and the pegs that actually give us definition and give us our shape. And so like it's really hard to remember those lovely summers and those moments where things were great. When you tell someone your story, you tell them about the dramatic moments where these things happened and they were the turning points in your narrative and in your story. And pilgrimage definitely does feel like a story. You know, it has got these huge, the story you're going to tell is the day when you had to put up your tent and it was tipping down with rain and your tent was already a puddle by the time you just like laid it out, and then you had to like basically sleep in a puddle or you know, poo in a bush or whatever it is you had to do. Because there's always amazing moments, but it's the really difficult moments that you get through that are the ones that you remember, and they're the adventure that make you feel like you took the ring to Mordor. And you know, if nothing happened in Lord of the Rings and they all just had a nice time, it wouldn't be the epic that we all know and love. So there is an element of that. Like I feel like it kind of adds to it. I mean, you're not looking for it and it's a nightmare when it's happening, but it's also part of the journey, I think, to an extent. But yeah.
Thank you. Wow.
I was reminded, it may sound a bit superficial, but I mean, suffering's already there. So I'm cautious about people needing to do more of it. So I suppose the invitation is really about, you know, I mean, suffering is already there. So it's about how we understand and how experiences deepen, if you like, our suffering to become understanding. So that it's not just about suffering. I guess I would just change that emphasis around suffering. That Thich Nhat Hanh has that, you know, great quote, you know, suffering's not enough. There's also the blue sky. And I think something about the insight that you may get from, you know, just the fact that we do suffer and is important. But can I pick up your other point about the pilgrim? I think the pilgrim is like a skin, really. It's like a social body. So I don't think there is one pilgrim. I think there are pilgrims, and I think there is something about that collective movement. And I'm going to use the word through a landscape and with a landscape, and the impermanence of that really invites that understanding of that, you know, we are impermanent, and that, you know, the landscape itself, I mean, that is always changing and moving, but it has a duration that is so much longer than our human duration, even though we're interacting with it. So there's something about this skin, the social body as a kind of skin. Even if you're walking alone, people pass you. You're on a trail. There's something about this organism all being and coming in sync. And I think within that, suffering is grounded. Somehow it becomes something else. I don't think it's something we well, it's not something I personally would need to emphasize, because I think it's already there for people.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the pilgrim is not the one wielding the suffering. They are the one who's experiencing it, and through the walk, maybe even exercising it or exercising in suffering. So it is a to ask whether it's necessary or whether it's something that we still have, or an old way of doing things, whether we can just sit joyously and disconnect from others, or sit in community and growing our own food and being happy amongst ourselves also turns a blind eye to other people's suffering. So it's a kind of very particular, curious question that you asked. I don't know necessarily whether I have a firm, direct solution to that or answer to that question, but it is something that particularly, the spur for most of our walking and engagement is to come closer and more akin to our suffering, to become to understand it better. So in many respects, I think we may not even, we are like the frog in the pot, that we are not necessarily exposing ourselves enough to it, that we become, we're able to ignore it when it's staring at us right in the face.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Can
you. I think
I-
we're just gonna
Oh.
have to close the session now, because it's
Oh my God.
8:30. I know we could just keep going, but it is, yeah, we've had a really, really powerful kind of conversation today, and yeah, I really thank you all for sharing your experiences, your research, your life work, but equally your your curiosities, and bringing us in on those. I would suggest, if you have follow-up conversation or thoughts or questions, feel free to log on to the Walk, Listen, Create website, and I think there is a space to comment underneath the actual post that you would have clicked on to get onto the Eventbrite. So let's keep the discussion flowing and going there, and I'm sure we can pick up on some of those points. And equally, yeah, I last week kind of felt it was possible to share an offering or 3 words basically that kind of summed up the evening, but I don't know if I can quite do that, as we landed on a really tricky ending, in terms of suffering and redemption and vulnerability, climate action, reciprocity, sacrifice. I think there's so many powerful words that came through today that really we just need to give a bit of space to. So I really think using the facility on the chat would be great to keep the conversation going and building this this collective new understanding of pilgrimage today. So I really, once again, like to thank all of our speakers, Jolie, Jonathan and Roxana, and please find out more, follow their work, and to Babak and for Andrew also for helping to pull together the panel and setting up everything, and thank you all for your attendance.